Hey, Dave McCormick, welcome to Battleground. You are fresh off a Senate race, and now you've got this amazing book out. It's called Superpower in Peril. And man, I read it cover to cover. I think it's phenomenal. So fill me in. How has life been post Senate run?
Yeah, well, hey, Sean, thanks for having me. It's great to see you, and thanks for all your support during the campaign. Listen, it's been a whole new world for me because I haven't not had a job since I was 18. And so my wife is saying, "Okay, I think it's time.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's time to get back to work." But the book has offered me an opportunity to really step back and think a bit. And I started the book a couple of years ago, long before I decided to run for the Senate. And the book was based on my belief that the country was headed in the wrong direction and that we needed a positive vision to take the Republican Party forward and to take the country forward. And that was honestly the same reason I ran for the Senate. So the book came before the Senate race, and the Senate race just reaffirmed everything that I was thinking, but it made it more tangible because I saw people on the ground that were reinforcing what fentanyl is doing or inflation's doing or these terrible policies that are taking our country in the wrong direction. And so in essence, the book is a plan for how to renew America. And there's no doubt we're in decline economically, spiritually, from a national security perspective, but decline's not inevitable. Neither is renewal. It depends on what we do. And this book is about what we do by educating our children. It's about confronting China. It's about securing America. And it's been a great opportunity to really put everything on paper.
Yeah, like I said, I loved it. And, anyone that knows me knows that I'm a closet policy wonk. I do love and appreciate somebody that understands policy. And so much about people, so much about running for office is, being inspired to do it for the right reasons, representing your constituents or your state. And what I loved about Superpower in Peril is that it blends your life story and things that influenced you with the policy positions that you hold now. And I think you're going to end up being in Washington someday, Dave, and you're going to be, I know that you're going to have a bold legislative agenda when you get there, but so much about it, what I like about this is you're not just a guy that's going down there that wants to go down there to lay on the railroad tracks and block productive legislation, especially if it's good for America. This book, it is a blueprint, a pathway forward for this country to get us back on the right path. And you say something in this book, and I'm going to read a direct quote, Dave, because this is something that resonated with me deeply. We need a rebirth of leadership across government, institutions, and society, and that is the central focus of this book. And so I guess there's so much that I want to talk to you about, Dave, but this quote, how do we get there when, like in a state in Pennsylvania, we elect a guy like John Fetterman who, I mean, I'll say this, he's been a trust fund baby his entire life, never really worked a day in his life, and has done nothing in the private sector and worked almost his entire career in government. So how do we shift the culture, Dave, and get get to a place where there's a rebirth of leadership across our institutions and in government?
Well, thanks for saying that. You are a great example of someone who also has served and been a patriot and thought about something bigger than yourself. And that's the first part of leadership is not about you, right? It's about others. It's about servant leadership and helping your platoon or your company or your country get on the right path. And, I'm optimistic. The book's optimistic. If you look at the cover's pretty daunting. It's like red and blue, and it's like America, superpower in peril, but which is what I believe. I believe we are in peril, but I also believe that we can renew ourselves because that's the American story. We've done it over and over again, and I talk about it in the book. I won't spend too much time on it, but I'm confident about our future because I've been there before. I'm older than you. I was 14, 15 during the final days of Carter. And it felt a lot like today. Inflation was going through the roof, and gas prices. We used to have to wait in line. It was odd days and even days to buy gasoline.
Jeez.
And my dad had this huge station wagon. It was the Country Squire with like wood on the sides, and we'd wait. We had to wait for 45 minutes to fill the gas tank. And we had Desert One, where we lost a bunch of servicemen trying to rescue our hostages from Iran. It was a travesty. And most Americans thought that the country was heading in the wrong direction, just like now. Most Americans, 80% of Americans think the country's heading in the wrong direction economically. $31 trillion of debt, 40-year high in inflation, fentanyl crisis, open borders, China challenging us. And so, just like we did it then with the rebirth of America under Ronald Reagan, we can do it now. Different problems, different solutions, but the same issue. We need leadership. And if you think about Pennsylvania, but you think about 2022, listen, we had two problems in my opinion, but they answer your broader question. The first problem is we need candidates who can win primaries and win general elections, right? It's about building a coalition of people who want to change the direction of the country. But you can't change the direction of the country without ideas. So we need ideas, and we need leaders who can win, and then we need leadership when they get there. And that's what this book is about. Here is an agenda, but an agenda of ideas doesn't mean anything if you can't get people. You can't get people to lead. And I try to talk about that, as you say in the book, but I don't talk about someone who's like Mr. Leadership. I got all the answers. I talk about someone who's been in lots of leadership positions and failed. You and I have talked about this, but I talk about being fired as the CEO of Bridgewater. That was pretty hard. I talk about struggling in the Army, and then I talk about of succeeding, but succeeding because of the experiences, the humility, the lessons that come with failure. And so I try to. It's kind of an open discussion about what it takes to win and to lead.
Well, so Dave, talk to me about that, because that was something that struck me as very, very compelling, just in your book, but also in your bio. I think I read a piece in the Post-Gazette about you that talked about being fired from Bridgewater. I think you were promoted to CEO, and then you were fired, and then you rose to CEO again, right?
Yeah.
How? I mean, give me a window into your mind in that moment. Like, you're told to step down, or they're firing you from being CEO. You could have taken your ball and went home. In fact, I bet you there's a lot of Americans that would have said the heck with this and done just that. But where were you on that? How did you process that? How did you talk about it with your family? And ultimately, how did you end up staying the course to rise back up to become CEO of that company again?
Yeah, well, I think the context is, people describe my career and they go, oh, this success and that success. And they describe it like it's this straight line where things just always went up. And what wasn't true, there was lots of struggles along the way. So I ended up being an all-state linebacker, and I got recruited to play football at West Point. But I started as a bench warmer, and I struggled. I failed some things in the Army, and yet I was a very successful Army officer. So, and there was lots of years that my dad and my brother used to get on the phone Sunday nights, and I left the Army. My dad was like, well, "You're going to lose your retirement. What are you doing? 15 more years, you have your retirement." And then I went to graduate school, and I was going to be a professor, and I decided not to be a professor. So my dad would get on the phone Sunday night with my brother and say, "What are we going to do about Dave? He doesn't have. He's not clear on his future. What's he going to do?" And it wasn't until I was like 35 or maybe 40, my dad said, "I think it's going to be okay." So it wasn't like I'd come into it, Ranger School, all these things. I'd come into it knowing that the path to success is often through failure. But then when it happens to you, you have to have this fight with yourself, the emotion of saying, "Oh, it's unfair. I didn't, I don't want to be treated that way." And your mind that says, "Okay, there's probably something to be learned from this." And that's what happened with me, where the guy who ran the firm, Ray Dalio, put me in the CEO job, and he said, "Listen, 18 months into, he goes, you're not making change happen fast enough."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my first reaction was to do just as you said, which is, okay, well, I'll take my talent somewhere else. And I thought about that, thought hard about it. We had some family issues going on that I didn't want to move my kids. And I said, I'm going to stick it out. And I stuck it out for a year. And then things started to go well. And some of the feedback I had received was I wasn't changing things quick enough. I wasn't balancing all the advice from different people. And I started to really get my groove. And I started to really succeed. And I became the president of the firm. And I was really, helping our firm grow and be successful. And then about 5 years later, I was happy, and Ray came to me and said, "I'd like you." You know, and by the way, I still didn't agree with him firing me. I thought the way he handled it wasn't right, but there was definitely lessons for me in it. And he asked me to be CEO again. I said, "Yeah, I don't think so. I'm doing fine, and things are going well." And he said, "What would it take?" And we talked about what it would take in terms of him stepping back, giving me the freedom to make the decisions I needed, the lessons I had learned, and we went forward on it. And I became CEO for the next 6 years, and it worked out really, really well. But honestly, in retrospect, it was a gift because I was a better leader because of it. The things he was pointing out to, I didn't think he should have fired me, but they were right.
Huh.
There was lessons there. And you know what has happened, Sean? I am so much better dealing with people that are struggling now. Even the people I've had to fire myself since then. I've had to fire people that weren't succeeding. That's part of being a good leader, is helping people move out of jobs where they can't succeed. I'm so much better at doing that now. So I wouldn't trade it. But man, did it hurt at the time. It was in the newspaper, front page of the Wall Street Journal. This isn't fun. So Lena Zito asked me this the other day. She said, "So when you're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times about losing the Senate race, does that bring back some parallels?" And it does in the following sense: when one door closes, another door opens, and failure is part of life, and failure is part of succeeding.
I mean, when did you learn that lesson, Dave? Because it seems like, as you talk about your path and where you are today and really living and realizing the American dream, that it wasn't a straight path, that all along the way there were pitfalls and there were failures. And it seems like what I'm hearing from you is that, your life is, and the same is true for me, really, is that it's filled with failures. But I think what it boils down to is, are you learning lessons from those things? When you fall down, are you picking something up? When you stand back up and move out and draw fire. Like, you went to West Point in 1983, right? Do I have that right? 1983.
1983. That's right.
I was 2.
Right.
So,
I know you. I knew you were going to bring that up.
Yeah. I had to. I was 2, but like I've toured West Point since. I was an ROTC guy, and I'll tell you, having, Al Albatuna, as they think on the curriculum now at West Point, which is just an honor of a lifetime, but I would go there and talk to the cadets and do leadership seminars, small groups with them. And one of the things that I realized very quickly was that there's no way I could do it. Those kids are up at like 4 a.m. Their whole day is structured, structured study time all the way into the night. And I think to myself, like, not only is there no way that I could do it, but these kids are special. But also seem to be gluttons for punishment. Like, you were a wrestler prior to that, and to wrestle, you have to be a glutton for punishment as well, because I wrestled and it was really, really, really difficult. But was there a moment when you got to West Point? I guess, first of all, how did you make the decision to go there? And number one. And the second part of the question was there a moment, like maybe it's on your first or second day, where you thought to yourself, "I immediately regret this decision"?
Oh, lots of regrets. And still to this moment, I say the best view of West Point is in the rearview mirror. When you're going up over the mountain on leave for the weekend, and you look back and say, "Oh, I got from Friday till Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon." Yeah, listen, it was the greatest decision I ever made, and I almost didn't make it. And the way it happened was, I'm like every Pennsylvania kid. I wanted to play football at Penn State.
Yeah,
and so,
exactly.
I had visions of playing football at Penn State, and if I was going to wrestle, I wanted to wrestle at Lehigh. So the two places and Lehigh at the time was a dominant,
absolutely right, yeah,
nationally
absolutely
top 5 in the country, and so that was what I was hoping for, and I was applying to both places, and I got recruited to wrestle and play football at West Point. And so I went up for a visit, and I just saw the same thing you said. I said, I just don't think this is for me. I was looking for a little less monastic. 4 years. I wanted to have more of a.
That's what it's like. I mean, that's what it's like.
Well, there's actually across the river, there's an institution where they train monks. And so, we used to say there's a lot of similarities, because once you went to West Point, you were locked up there for 4 years for the most part. And the joke was, they give you your privileges back, a day at a time, a week at a time. And by the time you graduate, you have the privileges of any freshman at any other college in the country. But I started. My dad said, and I really thank him for this. My dad said, you have to make a choice, which is best for you. The only thing I insist on is that you apply to West Point. And I said, okay, I'll apply. And so I applied, and I had no one in my family that had military experience. I had an uncle that had been in World War One, so I had no connection, and I got in. To my shock, I got in.
Amazing.
And Sean, it took on a life of its own. Someone sent me a newspaper article that it was in the local newspaper. Local kid gets accepted at West Point. It was the first time anybody had gone to an academy in decades. My town was probably 8,000 people. And it took on a life of its own. No one ever asked me, are you going to go? It was like, of course you're going to go. This was, and it I just sort of settled into it and said, okay, I'm going to do this. This is a privilege and an honor. And I did fine. I didn't love it most days, but it taught me so much. And I feel so blessed. And then it opened up my life to, a career that I would have never had otherwise. So, but that's how it happened. And the military, and this, Sean, I admire you so much for it. But the thing is, when you are in business or even government, and you're in Washington, or you're in these business circles, and you ask how many people in that room have served in the military, very few people.
That's right.
Very few people in the Acela corridor between Washington and New York have ever served or even know someone who had served in the military. And when I'm, where I grew up, or if I'm on the campaign trail in Pennsylvania, everywhere I go, I said, who's been in the military? Who hasn't? It's, this is a big part of connecting and understanding what it is to be an American. And so I feel so blessed with it. And, I was a small town kid from Pennsylvania. My first platoon had a white kid from rural Alabama. It had an African-American kid from Newark. It had my platoon sergeant, who, as for a new lieutenant, the platoon sergeant is everything. He was a Puerto Rican guy who, was 35, and he seemed like 100 years old at the time. I was 22. And, you know what? And this is I'll end on this point because I know I'm riffing, but no, I don't remember in my 5 years in the Army, my 4 years at West Point, I don't remember ever, I don't even think I knew who was a Republican or who was a Democrat or who was a conservative.
Same.
It was just about our country and being part of a team. And by the end, you would have gone into and did go into fire to protect that kid on your right or your left. You didn't know anything about them other than they were part of that team, and we were all committed to the mission and one another. And that's the thing that I got out of West Point in the military. That is it's the gift of a lifetime, and I would never trade it.
I mean, I think it's so powerful because that's what I took as well from my experience in the military, Dave. And I think, we talk about the virtues of diversity, and I mean, every business in the world talks about it now and how that's one of our greatest strengths as a country. And I agree, but I also say that that's just part of the answer. I think what makes America truly exceptional, and I saw that exceptional nature reflected in the eyes of my troops on the battlefield, is that it was really not just how diverse my platoon was, because we had guys from everywhere. As you said, it sounds like you had a similar experience, but it was the fact that we were able to, as Americans, look past all of our many differences and unite behind a common mission. And that has been, I think, for me anyway, Dave, has been, I mean, really the foundation of what it means to be a servant leader, and that leaders focus on first, last, and always doing everything that we can to bring people together, regardless of where we come from. It doesn't mean we always get it right.
No way. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
But do you think that because clearly that's shaped who you've become, Dave, and so much about your experience at West Point, and then leading men in combat, and being a platoon leader, and you find yourself the CEO of one of the largest firms, hedge funds in the world, but you also founded companies here in Western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, free markets, right?
Yeah. And I didn't found it, but I was one of their, I was the CEO of it. Yeah.
So you were the leader of that company essentially, and
eventually, yeah.
I mean, how does the perspective that you had from the military, from West Point, from your time in the Army, how did that shape your perspective as a business leader?
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, it was the foundation, because you learn the basic things about caring for people. But then I learned those various lessons over and over again. And in the book, I talk about, there's so many things written on leadership. And I said, there's, despite all this written about leadership, it's kind of ambiguous. If you ask 10 people what leadership is, they'd have different definitions. And so
Yes.
I talked about four things that for me have defined the leaders I've most admired, and I think are core to being the kind of leader I think America needs, but we need in general. And the one was vision. You need to know where leaders need to be able to take people where they need to go. So in other words, need to have a sense, whether it's your platoon into a mission, or whether it's a company into a changing marketplace, or whether it's America into a very dynamic, chaotic world. So that's obvious, but you need courage too. And courage isn't the kind of courage that you particularly demonstrate on the battlefield in your platoon. I mean, that is the courage when we think of courage. But there's courage to make hard choices. There's courage to be true to yourself. There's courage to speak truth to power, even though that may, in some instances, result in and you losing
Yeah.
an election, or losing your job, or whatever it is. So courage is, I think, a second part. And in the end, people want to know that their leaders are going to stand and put themselves in personal peril. The third thing we sort of talked about was the notion of humility. So the leadership, I think, requires you to know that you don't have all the answers and you're drawing on others. But humility also gives you the capacity to fail and learn from it, and then evolve and grow. Because if you have humility, you're fallible, and you're going to make mistakes. And being mistakes is part of being a good leader, as long as you own the mistakes, confront them, and learn as a result of it.
Hmm.
And then the fourth thing, which is the one I think we learned in the military, is about servant leadership, caring. You got to care about people. Leadership is not about you. And I tell that story, which is, for any military person, is such an obvious story, but for lots of people it's not. Which is, when you're done with a long road march, and you're out in the field, you stop and you check everybody's feet for blisters,
Hmm.
because if you get a blister, it gets infected, as you know, you're stuck.
Hmm.
And I just told the story of how my platoon sergeant and I would always do that for everybody in the platoon, or the squad leaders would do that, and we would double check it before we would sit down and take off our boots and change our socks and check for blisters. Or in the mess hall, who goes first? The platoon leader doesn't go first. It's the troops that go first, and then the platoon leader and the platoon sergeant come last. Those things seem
Absolutely.
so basic to you and to me, but they're not basic. They're not basic in much of society. Leaders eat last. It's not about you. It's about others. And that's, to answer your question in a roundabout way, that's the lesson from the military that I took most to heart. And I've tried to, not perfectly, but I've tried to always be an example of that in my leadership.
Well, what's fascinating about that, Dave, and by the way, I completely agree. But boy, you got your work cut out for you in Washington when you get there, because there are a lot of people that don't think
Yeah.
that put themselves first. And by the way, like when you're campaigning, like of course, like you're the guy that's on the ticket. You're telling your story. You're trying to sell yourself and sway voters. So I understand that, but it's a tough town to be in and be a servant leader. Are you afraid that when you get down there, because I believe it's just a matter of when, Dave, but when you get down there, you think you're gonna be able to hold on to that, or you think you'll let that town change you?
Well, listen, I hope that if I ever go to Washington, in some whatever capacity it is, I hope that I'm far enough along in my life to be able to lean on the lessons and the principles and the values that kind of got me here. And it comes with motivation. Like, what is this all about? So in my last, in my Senate run, I didn't wake up one morning and say, God, I'm not gonna be fulfilled as a human if I don't become the junior senator for Pennsylvania. Like,
Yeah.
that never occurred to me. I never had that as my goal. Like, being, that's, in some ways, it's a tough job, as you're saying, John.
Yeah, yeah,
It was
exactly.
never a goal. The goal was, hey, the country is headed in the wrong direction, you know? And I've been blessed, I've been privileged to have these great experiences and to have lived a really blessed life, hey, can I do something about that? So if your motivation is to do something about it, then I think it's hard to get captured by the whatever, because you're not going to be part of the whatever. You're going to change things. And if you can't change things, you don't want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I honestly believe it. And whether I could change things, if I got to Washington, would, I guess, we'd have to see in any capacity, elected or appointed or whatever. But if you start with the idea that, America is special and that we all have an obligation, there's this great quote I talk in the book about William F. Buckley, who you and I both admire as a great conservative,
Mm-hmm.
but he talks about citizenship. Citizenship is a privilege. We all are blessed to be in part of this country, but it's a responsibility. So it's like you run to the guns when the country needs you, you try to do your part. And when I decided to run, and you've experienced this with your own run, people say, why the hell would you ever put yourself in that? It's so nasty.
It is.
And, and I asked the simple question. I said, well, if not us, not me, then whom? If people that have been blessed
Exactly.
and don't need the job, and aren't looking at it as an opportunity for self-aggrandization, if people like us don't consider it and do it, then who will? And so that's how I've thought about it.
If good people don't run, bad people fill the vacuum. And
There's just no doubt about it.
And we can't have that. That's not good for the country. You talk about, Dave, courage being an important principle for leadership that you've learned. And I totally agree with you. You know what else requires an immense amount of courage? Being married with all the daughters that you have. I saw this was something that I think is remarkable. Is I saw this Adina, who by the way is a force of nature, is your
Indeed.
amazing wife. I saw this thing on Instagram that she posted of you. You all went to a Harry Styles concert. And by the way, my girls love Harry Styles too. I don't really know who he is, but whatever. But she's posted this story on Instagram, and it's just her with a camera going from one girl to the next. And how many girls you have in your family? Okay. So a lot of courage required there. Yeah. But she's just going right down the line of all your daughters who are clearly having the times of their lives, dancing like crazy, and it ends on you. And I'm like, that requires some real courage. You're just standing there like a dad, just like,
No, it reminds me. We got an initial puppy during COVID, and then 2 years later, out of craziness, we decided to get a second puppy. And the look in my face, in that concert is like the look of the first puppy when we showed up with the second puppy. What are you thinking? Yeah.
I mean, is that part of it, Dave? You've got 6 daughters. They're going to grow up in this country.
Yeah.
Are you afraid for their future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm afraid for their future. I'm afraid that we're headed down a dangerous path. And I'm afraid that, people who should be called to serve are not serving for the reasons we've talked about. I understand the logic of people not doing it. But the way people ask me, what was it like? And again, I feel like I'm talking to somebody who knows this. But if you remember the movie Gladiator, where Russell Crowe is in the middle of the arena, and there's all these people, cheering him, but there's also those people throwing things at him, and So you're in the arena, you're by yourself, and then you got your sword, and then all of a sudden the trap door comes up, and there's a tiger, and so then you got to kill the tiger, and then the next thing you know, there's a chariot, and that's the way politics is. You are in the arena, and it's a privilege to be in the arena, but it's not for the faint of heart. And so I know there's a burden, and I try to do everything I can to make sure there's no burden on my family or anything by making this choice. But I honestly think it was an honor in my case to run, and I have no regrets about it, because I think good people need to do all they can.
Well, you talk, so much about, and in this book, like I told you, as a blueprint, it's a way ahead for America. And you talk about a lot of very important policy issues that are some of the greatest debates of our time, Dave, and one of which is the idea of bringing jobs back to America and keeping jobs here in America, building back our manufacturing base and our industrial base, and that is a top issue in Pennsylvania, as you know. But the idea that like free trade comes with a lot of pretty amazing things. Like obviously we experience in this country an economic boom because of free trade. I think it's made some fairly strong alliances with other nations geopolitically all across the world. But you talk in this book about walking the fine line and the importance of free trade, but not at the expense of the American working man and woman. And that is so important that we embrace free trade, but also fair trade. How do you plan on taking that fight to Washington when you get there?
Well, I think, this is where I give President Trump a lot of credit. I think he put his finger on that challenge, which is that the promise of globalization and free trade hadn't delivered for a number of Americans. I'm not talking a small number. I'm talking half of America, right?
Yeah.
And so, and then I think a similar cousin of the problem of globalization is China. And listen, you can start with some basic things, which is there was a free trade ideology, orthodoxy that was to an extreme, and it missed some basic concepts. So if anyone's questioning that, just ask yourself the question: how is it possible? We all saw this front and center during COVID. How is it possible that the entire semiconductor industry is offshore and that 90% of the semiconductors we need are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China?
It's.
Does anybody think that makes sense? Right?
Right.
On national security terms, on economic, vitality for America, it makes no sense. Same with pharmaceuticals. I have to confess to you, I did not know or understand until COVID happened how dependent we were on China for pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
So you just have to pick examples like that. Those aren't small examples to just show how ridiculous the free trade orthodoxy had pushed us down a path where we were making decisions as a country that made absolutely no sense strategically. So that's the starting point. The second principle, which I think is really critical, and again, Bob Lighthizer, who was President Trump's trade representative, I think, is the notion of reciprocity. And with the WTO accession of China and our trade relations, that notion of reciprocity, you hear that word thrown around, but it's not happening. In many of our trade relationships, certainly with China, there's not reciprocity. And so if we're going to give access to U.S. markets in our trade relationships, we need to have fair opportunity in their markets. So that's what fair trade means. And that's not happening. And then the third piece of the trade orthodoxy, which I think is called into question, is, listen, I'm not in favor of tariffs as a general rule, but I think there are instances, and I think China in the Trump administration was an example of where we can use tariffs to sort of right the ship and rebalance trade relations, and as a way to get geopolitical and negotiating advantage. So those three things I just said are basic premises that are different than what the free trade orthodoxy has been. And if we do those things differently and begin to strategically decouple from China and elsewhere, that's going to have a huge impact for manufacturing jobs in America. We can't be non-competitive, by the way. We have to still be efficient, market-driven businesses. So we can't subsidize things like, unfortunately, the Biden administration is doing in so many ways. But we can ensure that the American worker gets a fair shot. And if the American worker gets a fair shot, they're going to win a lot more than they lose. And that hasn't happened in the decades preceding 2016. And I think we're on a reset now, but it took a big redirection that I think President Trump tapped into very wisely.
I mean, I totally agree. And I mean, there's so many aspects of this book that just dovetail perfectly from an economic and national security standpoint with Trump populism, Dave. And really the blending of more traditional conservative positions with Trump populism to plot a way ahead. You talk about COVID, and you talk about all of these things that COVID revealed and the risks that I think that our country was exposed to in China. You talk about the economic implications of free trade arrangements with China, and maybe the fact that China is definitely exploiting that relationship. But from a national security standpoint, we have critical aspects of our supply chain almost exclusively made in China. You've got Apple computers making iPhones in China. You've got rare earth metals and rare earth minerals being mined in China, by and large, that are mostly through child slave labor. In order for us to embrace this green energy, renewable energy that the Biden administration is pushing so much, it almost empowers China. Well, it does empower China because most of that stuff is mined over there. So from a national security standpoint, Dave, how how do we decouple from China in that way? Because I do think, and you addressed it some in this book, but I do think that that has profound national security implications for our country, not just now, but moving forward as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it starts with a point I try to make in the book, and there's a chapter about technology leadership. And when you read what's going on with technology, it should scare you to death because right, technology and innovation have been what has made America the superpower in the world. We've always been on the forefront of that, and our economic model is failing us. And the best example of how it's failing us is there's just a report that came out. It was in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago from an Australian think tank, and it identified 44 technologies that are critical to the economic vitality, but also the national security of a country today. And of those 44 technologies, China's in the lead in 37. This is satellite, artificial intelligence, quantum science, and that's unacceptable. And the reason is that we have not had a dedicated strategy. China has a plan for global dominance and for perpetuating a techno-authoritarian model. They're very explicit in their plans. If you go back to the various congresses, you'll see technology leadership in these. And what's different now, Sean, is that convergence of technology, economic well-being, and national security is at all new levels. 5G. You can't think of 5G without thinking about economic growth and national security at the same time. These technologies are one and the same for economic success, and they're mostly zero sum. So once you get a predominant position, it's hard for other countries to break in. So we need a plan for promoting those technologies in a way that's not the Chinese model, which is state-owned enterprises. It's not the Democrats' model, which is industrial policy with a bunch of directives around social engineering and climate change. It's a approach for innovation policy that's driven by free markets principles, but helps direct capital to those areas where we need to have big investment to win. And we don't have a plan for that. And that's what one of the things the book tries to do. And in it, to your point about traditional conservatism and populism, I'm trying to say stop saying this or that. That's not the way to think about it. We're in a new world where there's a set of realities we have to embrace, and the anger people feel with the system leaving them behind that's driving populism. Hey, by the way, they have a point. They have a right to be angry, right? So there's that one section you may recall which says, "What would Milton Friedman think?" And I talk about how Milton Friedman, who, as you know, is the dean of free market conservatism. What would Milton Friedman think about what I'm saying about these technology policies? And I don't really know what Milton Friedman is saying, but my question to Milton Friedman is, when you're behind in 37 of 44 technologies, it's going to determine leadership in the world. What are you going to do, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's sorry, a long-winded approach, but that's what I'm trying to do with the book.
Well, I mean, it's clear as day. And you talk about, speaking of technology, the idea of data, right? The data is almost like a currency today that's largely unregulated here and untapped in our country. We don't really know what to do with it, but China seems to have a goal, at least a large-scale global goal, of sucking up as much American data as possible. And I'm sure you saw the spy balloon that basically floated from the West Coast to the East Coast and wasn't shot down until it was over the Carolina somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. But the idea that the Chinese spy balloon was sucking up as much American data as humanly possible. The debate right now, if you turn on Fox News, is and I think there's a bill on the Senate floor about this, Dave, about should we ban TikTok or not? And right. I think the Chinese spy balloon was pretty bad, but you got TikTok on your phone. It's basically like having a spy balloon on every American phone in the entire country. So how do we, I mean, my God, it just feels like we're, like you mentioned it, like being behind the power curve here to China. China has a plan. We don't.
Right. Well, listen, I'd say there's a couple of different dimensions of this. Data is so important because data gives insight to others, and you make yourself vulnerable the more of your data is available. So if a bunch of soldiers are on their Fitbits in Afghanistan and the Chinese have access to that data. That's important information, right? So
Yes, yes.
so if it gives you a little bit of an eerie feeling when you Google something like yeah, you want to buy a new set of sneakers, and then every feed you get on your email and your social media from that point forward includes an advertisement for sneakers,
Yeah.
right? So so this data is it makes us all vulnerable, and there's no controls whatsoever. There's no privacy. The social media companies have access. TikTok has access. What's interesting to this is TikTok has no restrictions on how children access it in the United States. There's all sorts of restrictions on how children access TikTok in China,
Yes.
right? So one thing is personal privacy and vulnerability. The second is that data is a strategic asset. You know, The Economist had this article recently that said data is the new oil. It's not the new oil. It's strategic like oil, but oil, once you use it, is gone. Data can be used over and over again. And the best example of the power of data is the collaboration that happened with the COVID vaccines. So
Mm.
all the pharmaceutical companies came together and they shared their data, and we made huge strides under warp speed that would have never happened if without that data sharing. And incidentally, the Chinese didn't share their data. And
Hmm.
China has complete control over its data of its citizens, which is terrible from a human liberty perspective, but very valuable from an innovation perspective. So that's the second thing that we have to have a framework for dealing with. The third thing, and I know you feel this as a guy with kids and as someone who's focused on ensuring that we have a marketplace of ideas, social media has completely hijacked our ability to have an objective, fact-based discourse
Hmm.
in our country. The liberal media, combined with the social media leaning to the left, allows things to happen like we can't have a meaningful discussion until right now
Hmm.
about the origins of COVID. Oh, this is breakthrough thinking that COVID, which originated in Wuhan, might be connected to the lab that does experiments in Wuhan. The fact that that
I-
was suppressed is madness. The same with the Hunter Biden laptop. All these things. So we don't have a meaningful exchange of ideas anymore when so many of us are dependent on social media. So this is one of those cases where you say the blending of populism and traditional conservatism. I try to call out in my book. Listen, I'm going to say something right now that's different from traditional conservatism. Traditional conservatism, hands off. Government does get
right.
involved.
Right.
I mostly agree with that. More government is bad, less government good. Most of the time, like in the fracking industry, less government is better. But on big tech, this is where I think we need more government involvement to make sure that the social media companies are held accountable for the bias that exists across those platforms, and that's a sensitive issue. But that and technology policy are the two areas where I think the government needs to play a more aggressive role to protect our interests.
I mean, I totally agree, especially with regard. I mean, yes, generally speaking, I want the government out of every aspect of our lives. But you got these huge companies, like global companies, and this is the thing that bothers me about it, Dave. And you have, I don't want to even call out like somebody like Google, because Google does lots of great things, but they're founded here in America, yet they have interests all over the world and a huge market in China. And half the time, I wonder with some of their global policies that come out, do they even recognize that they're a country that is based and founded in America that should be focused on American primacy? And so some of these companies have just gotten so big, the monopolistic tendencies therein are
No,
harmful
I
to the
agree
average
with you.
American.
I agree with you. And listen, this is, I think, an area like the thing about a campaign is you get 30 seconds. The thing about a book is you get to talk about this. But I
Mm-hmm.
think you're right. And take Google as an example. I agree with you. Google's created lots of jobs. But two things that I would say are really problematic. One is, if you remember, Project Maven was,
That's
right.
exactly what I was thinking about.
Right.
Yes.
So most of these tech companies, Microsoft's an example, is a example the other way, but most of these
Mm-hmm.
big tech companies do not collaborate with the Pentagon. That's changing a little bit, but and the reason is that their workers, the tech workers, don't want to be associated with work in defense. I think that's unacceptable,
I do
right? If
too.
you look at our success in the Cold War, the merger of American industry with defense spending was how we had the success we had. And these companies are American companies first. And I think the idea that they're not collaborating or willing to collaborate with the U.S. military in pursuit of military interests, that's a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and is something that should be recognized and called out. And the benefits of being an American company maybe shouldn't go to companies that won't support America, right? That's one.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
The second is, and I've done business around the globe, and in the case of China, I think we do need, and I lay out a whole chapter in the book around a holistic plan, whole of nation strategy for dealing with China, strategic decoupling, holding China accountable for everything from the Wuhan virus to its thievery to human rights abuses, coordinating with our allies in a very thoughtful way about how we pursue U.S. interests by partnering with them. Some of those allies have our most significant intel, so forth. But I also say we need an outbound investment process to review investments. So a good example of this, which I can't believe this is still the case, Sean, but it is. After all this talk about China, after all that we know, there are still investment companies in the United States, Silicon Valley companies, that are investing in companies in China that are part of or work with the Chinese military, the PLA.
Wow. Wow.
Right? So artificial intelligence companies are investing in China, their main customer is the PLA. That's unacceptable.
It is.
It should be obvious to a U.S. company that we should do it, but we should make it more obvious by restricting it.
Yes.
And we should have an outbound. I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar with CFIUS, which is the review we do of investments in the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should have a similar a review of investments that go outside the country to places like China and probably some other countries where it poses any risk to U.S. interests.
Why don't we? I mean, that is. I'm flabbergasted by that. And
Yeah,
I'm ashamed to
it's
say
an
that I
obvious
didn't
thing.
know.
It's an obvious thing, and there's some on Capitol Hill talking about it. But this is where when I ran for the Senate in 2022, I was excited because I think as someone who's been in the military, served at the highest levels of business, and been in government, to tackle these issues, you need confidence, and confidence comes from being able to see all the different dimensions of a problem and then shooting a direction that makes sense. And I sadly wasn't able to do that because I lost the race. But I'm trying to do that with this book. And if the book was wildly successful in my mind, what that would mean is that people talk about it. And
Mm-hmm.
and this forces people to sort of engage on a possible agenda. Maybe it's this agenda, maybe it's another one. But the thing I'm convinced about, and I'm not a political pundit, I'm convinced we're not going to change the country as Republicans unless we win elections.
Exactly.
And we're not going to win elections unless we have a vision and plan for the future. We're not going to win elections looking backwards. We're going to win elections looking forwards. And that's what I'm trying to do with the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, Leadership 101, we talked about it a little bit during this interview. Leaders project a vision on the horizon, and they bring people with them in support of that vision. And so, I mean, I got to ask before I let you go, and I want to be respectful of your time because you've given me a lot of it. What's next for you, Dave? I mean, and give us a sense of what the heck is going on in Pennsylvania. Like, if Fetterman, where is he? What's the process? I mean, like, and where's your head at with the next cycle?
Yeah, well, it's I've talked about this. You can't you can't do what I've done, which is quit your job, throw yourself into a Senate race because you think the country's going in the wrong direction, and if you fall 900 votes short, say, "Oh, I was just kidding," right? So the motivation to serve, the motivation to help our country is strong, and I feel more strong now than I did when I ran.
Mm-hmm.
How to best serve, I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure. As a family, we haven't decided. One way would be to run for the Senate for Senator Casey's seat, which he currently holds, which would be 24. I don't know about Senator Fetterman. No one can watch what's happening with him and not feel, like in your heart, like pray for that family.
I agree.
He's obviously very sick.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think as a practical matter, it raises legitimate questions of did we know everything as voters in November? And, it also just is emblematic. This is the first time in 76 years we've had two Democratic senators for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians deserve better in that, in my opinion. And so, we're thinking about that, but when we're praying about it, but we're not going to make any decisions anytime soon. And we're trying to, hopefully make this a successful book. And that would be, for me, a service if I could do that and do it well.
Well, phase 1 of the operation, before Dave decides if he's going to run, is go get this book. Superpower in Peril is a great book.
Right, man.
If you're a Republican that's interested in the future of the country and a roadmap to take us there, get the book. It's great. I'm sure you can get it wherever books are sold, and we'll be following you, Dave. I mean, you ran a great campaign. And thank you for coming on onto Battleground, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You can buy the book if you just go to davemccormickbook.com, and that'll take you right to the Amazon link. And listen, it was a labor of love in the sense that it's all about trying to get the country moving in the right direction. And really grateful to you. I'm excited about this podcast. I've listened to a number of them, and they're great. And you're a great person to do it.
Thanks, Dave.
As I said, you're a great patriot and you know this stuff. But more than that, you are focused on solutions to make our country better. And rhetoric's great, but we need solutions. And so thanks for what you're doing.
Oh, you're welcome. Good luck, man. And anytime you need anything, you know where to find me.
All right. See you soon. Thank you.
See you, Dave.